Okay, so I know that this is the part of the video where I should be opening by saying something really profound, or maybe just with a lot of energy, like, hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the causes of IBS. But that is not my truth. That's just not the mental space that I'm in right now. Because the reality is I have put off filming this video for over a year since having researched this topic, because researching the causes of IBS was honestly a little bit traumatizing. Spoiler alert, there is not one singular cause. There are a lot of different potential contributing factors that we have found to be associated with developing IBS. And we're just the kind of people that can't really take things at face value. We need to know about mechanisms. We need to know how and why. And so this topic got out of control really quickly because all of a sudden we were looking into topics like microbiology, neurology, endocrinology, immunology, all of the ologies, okay? Like we were covering all of the bases. It was really getting out of control. It was so bad that there was this one day we were working together at this one co-working space, and we looked like psychos, you guys. Like we had paper out, just drawing out like how everything's like interconnected. And then we had to take it to the conference room so we could like draw it out on this whiteboard, just trying to like piece it all together. And we walked out of there into this room full of people just being like, it's all connected, man. Like, just sounding like total conspiracy theorists, right? So we have taken a social hit trying to understand the complexity of IBS. And let me tell you guys, I don't care who's out there saying that they know the root cause of IBS. They don't. It is super complicated. Now, I realize that it's probably super annoying that we can't give you one singular root cause answer about what brings on IBS, but I can tell you that IBS is well recognized as a disorder of gut-brain interaction. So just know that all of the things we're going to be talking about today, even though they're not specific causes, but more so things that have been associated with the development of IBS, all appear to be things that in some way or another may be impacting the way that the gut and brain communicate in IBS. So to cover all of our bases, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the role of stress in the development of IBS. And then we're going to talk about some different risk factors that have been associated with IBS. And then finally, we're going to talk about some observed underlying mechanisms that may be going on in people with IBS that could be leading to IBS symptoms. First things first, let's talk about stress, because we can't talk about IBS without discussing stress, because if you look very closely when it comes to the different contributing factors that lead up to an IBS diagnosis, somewhere in there is usually some form of stress that's going on. Now, unfortunately for us, there are many ways in which stress can manifest in our lives, both from a physiological standpoint, such as developing an acute gastrointestinal illness, for example, or also from a psychological standpoint. So experiences like neglect or abuse, or maybe overwhelming caregiving responsibilities. All of these different forms of physical and psychological stressors can be detrimental to our health if they are strong enough or persistent enough. And this can result in a phenomenon called allostatic overload, where our body really feels the wear and tear of stress. And that wear and tear can result in alterations in the way our nervous system functions, or even in the way that our immune system functions. In some cases, stress might even contribute to chronic low-grade inflammation or changes in endocrine functioning. And these are all very relevant factors to IBS, as you'll see here soon. So now that we've laid that foundation about stress, let's talk about some of the different risk factors that have been associated with the development of IBS. And to do that, we're going to break this down into 3 different categories, including fixed traits, which are things that are inherent to us that we don't choose, that may be upping our odds of having IBS, and also environmental influences, which are things that are happening outside of us that can increase our risk of having IBS. And then there is this gray area where there's kind of this overlap between fixed traits and environmental influences, where it's hard to determine, what came first. Was it the environment, or was it a fixed trait that predisposed someone to having IBS? So let's start by talking about some different fixed traits that may up your odds of having IBS. And some of these fixed traits include things like gender, age, and genetics. So when it comes to gender, females are a lot more commonly diagnosed with IBS than males, though of course anyone of any gender can develop IBS. And then as far as age goes, it's definitely something that happens in people who are younger quite a bit more often. Most often, IBS is diagnosed in those who are less than 50 years of age, though again, it can be diagnosed at any time in life. And then finally, genetics. It is possible that you may have inherited certain genes from your parents that could have upped your odds of developing IBS.
Before we continue, I want to quickly tell you about IBSprobiotics.org. So this started out as a research project, But then we ended up turning it into this really cool comparison tool. When you go on the site, you can easily compare which probiotics were most effective for different IBS symptoms, all exclusively based off of clinical studies. In fact, we spent the past 2 years building it, having analyzed over 50 different probiotics across more than 75 placebo-controlled trials. And the results surprised us. For example, we found that some really popular probiotics were nowhere near as effective as some lesser-known options, and there were even some probiotics that seemed to do more harm than good. So I hope this free tool helps you to cut through the marketing hype and saves you a ton of time when evaluating a probiotic.
Now let's talk about another category of risk factors called environmental influences. And sadly, some of these are very tragic. For instance, we know that early adverse life events in childhood, such as child abuse, trauma, neglect, things of that nature have been associated with the development of IBS. And then we also know that there are physical stressors like gastrointestinal infections, for instance, that also up our odds of IBS. So for instance, somebody having gastroenteritis, maybe they're having diarrhea and vomiting, an acute episode of something like that, their odds of going on to develop IBS are about 1 in 10, making post-infectious IBS one of the strongest correlations that we have between an environmental influence and the development of IBS. Now let's talk about some factors that don't fit very neatly into environmental traits versus fixed traits because there's a little bit of overlap. And these include things like epigenetics and also our mental health. Now, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds here with epigenetics, but basically what you need to know is that while you may inherit some fixed genes from your parents, that the environment can influence the way that those genes express. And the way that gene expression is altered by our environment could potentially set us up for developing certain conditions like IBS if there's the wrong mix of circumstances. And then when it comes to mental health, about 40 to 60% of people with an IBS diagnosis also have a mental health diagnosis, things like anxiety or depression, for instance. And so this is one that's a little bit hard to tease out because obviously our environment influences our mental health and our biology influences our mental health. So it's a chicken and the egg scenario. We're not really sure which came first, or maybe it's a combination of factors, which often is the case. And now we're going to talk about some underlying mechanisms that may play a role in provoking or bringing about IBS. And when it comes to those underlying mechanisms, they all have to do with some sort of faulty communication that's happening between the gut and the brain. And there are many ways in which this can happen. So some of the dysfunction in gut-brain interaction obviously happens at the level of the nervous system. And this can look like visceral hypersensitivity, where we are experiencing pain, perhaps at lower thresholds with less of a pain stimulus than others might require to perceive that same level of pain. For some individuals, nervous system dysfunction can also look like alterations in our fight or flight response as opposed to our rest and digest response, which does impact our bowel symptoms and things like inflammation. Some individuals with IBS also seem to have alterations in their hormonal sort of stress response system called the HPA axis. There may also be some alterations in neurotransmitters in people who have IBS, both in the intestines as well as in the brain. But I just want to make it very clear that intestinal neurotransmitters and brain-derived neurotransmitters are not one and the same. For instance, serotonin from the gut does not cross the blood-brain barrier. Other alterations observed in people with IBS include things like alterations in immune activity, or alterations in the gut microbiome, or even intestinal barrier integrity. So there are clearly a lot of different factors at play here that may be perceived as a little bit different from the norm and that could be provoking IBS symptoms. But like I was saying earlier, it's all connected, man. I mean, like these things all interplay in so many different complicated ways. So it's really hard to tease out what may have gone wrong first. Now, if there is anything that you take away from this entire video after just getting this glimpse into potential contributing factors and underlying mechanisms in IBS, I hope it's that nobody chooses to have IBS, that a lot of these things that happen that contribute to the condition are things that happen outside of our conscious awareness or control. Now, of course, the underlying dysfunction that has been observed in IBS is a window of opportunity to intervene with different therapies that may help to gain control over IBS symptoms. But I think it just needs to be so apparent that nobody is having their IBS symptoms because it's all in their head, that there are truly these mechanisms between the gut and the brain that are provoking symptoms, and they are real and legitimate. So please don't let anyone ever talk to you as though that this is something that you have just come up with in your mind. And that's all I'm going to be covering today about the causes of IBS. But if you have any questions for us, then please be sure to leave us a comment down below. We would love to hear from you.
Thanks for watching this video. And as a quick reminder, don't forget to check out ibsprobiotics.org. We're really proud of this research project turned comparison tool that we've made. And of course, it is free and publicly available. And if you want to keep up to date with the latest IBS research, you can follow me here. See you next time.